When you treat church like a product to be consumed, that you kind of forfeit the right to be upset when people find a better product.
This has been a weird time for probably all of our churches, as we have not only dealt with COVID, that because of COVID, it's kind of politicized our decisions, whether we open or close or how we meet and stuff like that, whether we require masks, like that stuff has affected our, like people have looked at us differently based on those decisions. And then if you did anything when it came to George Floyd's death, Black Lives Matter, all that kind of stuff, you may have had some people in your church that were pretty upset, whether you made a sermon that was about racial reconciliation, or maybe you made a sermon that wasn't about that, or maybe you didn't say anything. And so I feel like, I don't know if Barna is ever going to do a study, or Lifeway Research can do a study, like how many people have turned in membership resignations, because I'm sure it's astronomical. I'm sure that like people have moved around. Plus, added to the fact that now church, you can now see any church everywhere. You can see what other churches in your city are doing. And so people are like virtual church hopping. And I just know that I have had people in my church who are close friends of mine who were in my ministry who have now, I've seen in my email inbox that they have given me a membership resignation. And so a couple of things I've noticed is like, I don't know if there is I've never heard of a clear formal process of how to resign as a member of a church. Like I've never heard that in my membership classes. Like, now if you were to leave, this is what you should do. I've never heard that before. And so I've noticed that when people leave, I'll get an email that I'm CC'd on with a bunch of other pastors. I was told privately in a BCC that was emails to like elders or something. Like there's just so many different things. And the reasons why people are leaving are all across the board. I saw an email, one said that our church was leaning towards Marxism and stuff like that. And then I saw another church where it said like, we are watering down the gospel. And it's like, I don't think either of those things are true. But like my youth pastor in me says, hey, go to a church that is going to serve you well, right? Like that's I guess my inclination. But I think becoming this new role as a campus pastor, these things have hit me a little bit harder than when I was in a youth pastor and a high school kid said, the other youth group is giving away free pizza every Sunday night, so we're going to go there. Like it feels a little different now. And so my question for you guys is, how have you handled or dealt with membership resignations? I think I wrote some more questions like, how did you handle it? What do you think are the right reasons and the wrong reasons, right ways or wrong ways to handle membership resignation? And do you have any requirements or expectation from those members? Like, do they have to have something in writing? Do they have to meet with you before they leave? Do you have to meet with them? And maybe if you have any good stories in all this, I would love to hear it. But yeah, let's talk about membership resignation for a little bit. Delmar.
Yeah, I believe that your activity comes from your philosophy on membership, to be honest. And I think when you treat church like a product to be consumed, that you kind of forfeit the right to be upset when people find a better product. Just to be honest.
Wow.
You know,
that's a quote.
Quotable.
Like, I was thinking about that earlier today because like how many times were we like, oh, we're going to have a better product. We're going to have a better worship service. We're going to have a flashier pastor with more hair and, you know, like whatever you want to call.
Hey now.
Yeah. Hey, I feel you. There's a reason I wear a hat. But I think when we look at it as a product, it's back to that Americanization of the gospel. And I think my philosophy that I always try to run to, and granted, I know that we are providing a very felt thing for people. I know that. But what I believe is if you believe church is a family, then that's something you fight for. You know, like I believe you fight for a family. So because that's my philosophy, when someone leaves, I want to know, and I need to step into that conversation just like I would my own brother if he was like, I don't ever want to talk to you again. And sometimes those are painful conversations because you hear things that you don't want to hear, which ironically is what the people who treat church like a product probably need to hear. But we don't step into those conversations because it's an ebb and road, it's a rotating door. So for me, it starts with that philosophy. And I do think it's a balancing act. But when it does, when they're leaving, what comes to my mind first, because I try to put myself in the other quadrant, is this: are they running from something or to something? You know, that's where I go into that conversation. Why are they leaving? If they're leaving, my job isn't convince them to stay; it's to find out why. And if I find out they're running from something, well, then sometimes I'll just kind of lean in and be honest. But if I see that God's calling them to something, I kind of release that a little bit. So
I think coming from big church world into tiny itty bitty church world, it's been such a different mindset.
Yeah.
I remember being at a big church that had several thousand members, and if someone left to go to the church down the street, it was like a slap in the face. Like, what could they possibly have there that we don't have? You know, we have programming for every member of your family. We have this ministry, we have that ministry. And so it felt kind of like it was a full-on rejection. Like, no, we don't like the way that you're doing it. We're going to go here where they're doing it differently. But now being at a church that's, 70, 75 people on a good week, when someone leaves and says, hey, for our family, the youth ministry is bigger, there's more kids, it just makes sense for us to be here. I'm like, dude, I get it. Like, my kids go to Awana at the giant Southern Baptist church that's 3 miles away. And I would say about a third of the members of our small groups in our church are from other churches that, they have the big church with all the bells and whistles, but they like the small, intimate family feel of parts of our ministry. I think God's going to call different people to different things. And that might mean that he's going to call people to be at a different church for a season. Especially, we say, well, as a New Testament church, well, the New Testament church had one church per town. Maybe there were 2 churches, one for the Jews, one for the Gentiles, which is why we have both Romans and Hebrews written at about the same time, because they were to 2 different groups. But it's not like in the New Testament, they couldn't go to the church down the street if they liked one preacher better than the other. So that's not where we're at right now. Now, I would assume that if someone is in a covenant relationship with you, if they've signed their thing, they've said, we're going to be doing this together, they owe you a conversation.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, if somebody is leaving, good luck trying to have that conversation with them, because by the time they've decided to leave, they're gone. So you're probably not going to be able to sit them down and have a post-mortem. And if you are, 6 months from now might be a better time than doing it tomorrow.
That's fair. Man, I think you just said something that I really get. Like, you have relationship with the other pastors in your community.
Yes.
What I've learned is having that relationship is one of the best ways to close the back door. Because I've had people go to a different church and the pastor say, oh, okay, hey, so-and-so, so you're over there at Pacala. Like, they're like, oh no, I'm trying to run. And this guy has a relationship. But actually, I think sometimes it helps us fill in the gaps. I had a family come to our church and I'm like, oh, I know this family and I know his pastor. He's a good friend of mine. So I met with the pastor, and the pastor actually told me, he said, Dale, I actually sent them your way. He goes, our church, the thing you have is actually something we don't have. And it broke my heart because I love this family, but I was watching they struggle through this, and I think that they need to be there. So simply by having that doorway of communication open, it's almost, instead of just slamming doors, it's more like handing them off if we need to. So those relationships is real important for me. One of the things I'm doing during COVID is I try to meet with one local pastor a week and take him out for coffee, simply to have that relationship for this very reason.
Yeah, Dale, you're right. Relationships are key. We had a similar situation last year. A buddy of mine called and said, hey, so-and-so's here at my church. Isn't he a member at your church? And I said, yes, he is. And a few months later, that guy tried to join his church, and he wouldn't let him join until he sent him back to Lakeview to have the conversation with us as to why he left, and then he let him join his church. It was really solid.
That's cool.
Did that happen? Did it all happen?
Yeah, it actually happened.
Oh, okay, cool. So it worked out. That's awesome.
I don't think it will always work out that way, but it did in this instance.
That one time, it was awesome.
It was awesome.
I mean, honestly, that is a lot more like what probably church discipline needed to look like in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Because elders were really the shepherds over a whole city worth of little house churches. So you couldn't just run from one to the other without, there being. So I do think that that's an area where, as Protestants, we probably, and especially as evangelical independent churches, we may suffer a little bit because we don't, we're kind of like we're each our own little thing, and we don't always have those relationships. But I think that's what I was going to say from the beginning of this section, is just having relationships with other pastors. I've done the same thing. Like, I've had people come and they start bad mouthing another church, and when you start to say, "Oh yeah, I know Pastor so and so," I can't believe that's happening. They're like, and it kind of shuts it down, because honestly, you don't want that, because if they're coming to your church with that attitude, you're the next one on their list.
Wow.
It's going to be 6 months or a couple of years, and you're going to be the next one being talked about like that. And for me, I would say maybe equally important to shepherding the people that are leaving, or the family that is leaving, is also taking a step back as the overseer, or one of the overseers or elders of the church, and making sure that you are shepherding the entire flock through even one family transitioning out, because it will affect a lot of other people in your church. And what you don't want to have happen is, and it's hard because it's not like something you can control, but you do need to engage in shepherding people, sort of the rumor mill of why are they leaving and what happened, and conversations happening inappropriately with other people that shouldn't be happening. And we had an experience here, I don't know, it's been a year or a year and a half, where there was a family that left, and they basically just like weren't around anymore. They just kind of were gone. And so that created a situation where I had information that I wasn't at liberty to share with other people, but my role in that is to shepherd them through someone else leaving for in a bad way and for bad reasons. And that's just as important as shepherding the actual family that left, if you get that opportunity. Of course, in a perfect world, like you guys have been saying, you would have some kind of, in my opinion, membership agreement or covenant or whatever, where an exit interview is part of the process, if you're leaving. But you just don't always get that. And I think to be vulnerable about it, like it hurts, and it makes you jealous, and it makes you frustrated when people leave. Like, we're human beings, and we have insecurities and stuff too. And I think one of the things that I've heard multiple people say to me and to other pastors when they're leaving is they'll try to say, like, well, it's not personal, it's not a personal thing. But the reality is, what makes you a good pastor is that it is personal for you with everybody in your church, because you love them as people. So
That's good.
it's part of the role. Like, we open ourselves up to being vulnerable, to being hurt by every person in our church. And if we have good relationships, for the ability for us to hurt people in our church in a way that is really impactful too. So that's just all part of it. It's messy. I mean, it's family. It's messy.
And I think there's some time. Oh, sorry, Frank, you had to say something?
No, go for it.
There's a couple times we just got to realize that it's not our job to retain them forever. Like we live in a military town. Yeah. I know I'm going to interact with some of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life for about 2 to 3 years. So when sometimes you have the fortune of seeing the end of the road for them at your church. So what we do is we try to help them find a church in a new space. Like if they're going to be moving to Florida, well, hey, I know a couple guys that I can probably connect you with, who can get you into church. Same way with college students. We know one of our biggest drops offs is when they go to college. So with our young adult programs, we actually do guidance counseling like you would for college with your professor. You sit down and plan out your 4 years. I sit down, they fill out a form. We plan out a rough tentative what their next 4 years look like, who they're going to be in church with, where they're going to be. And so I do think sometimes not taking it personal and realizing that some people you can kind of identify when their termination of membership or transfer is going to be, and let's help them do that well. So that way, one day when they can sit down for a minute, they know what it's like to be a part of that fellowship.
I think you have to see things in terms of seasons too.
Yeah.
Like, and especially, again, coming out of the first, 15 years of my ministry career in big churches and now being in a little church. In a big church, every couple of weeks, someone would show up like, this is so great. I can just show up and I can attend, which is not the goal. That's not how discipleship works. But sometimes you've been burned by a church and you kind of want to hit the reset button, and then going to a big church for a time where you can just be and kind of be anonymous makes sense. And Tim and I joke all the time about the cycle of the people that feel burned by the big churches. So then they want to come and, it's almost like tourism. Like, oh, isn't this cute? The pastor's wife is the children's person. And, oh, it's so quaint. and you kind of know in the back of your head, okay, you've got about 2 years for them to be here, and then that itch is going to start to scratch again. But I think the point of discipleship is to hand them off healthier than when they arrived. And ultimately, it's not your responsibility to retain people. That's not what God has called you to do. And chances are, if somebody is jumping from one church to another, there's some immaturity there to begin with. And our job is to make disciples. So our job is to instill health and discipleship and have people be in a better place. And then if 2 years from now, they want to be at a place that has a different style of music, or they want their teenagers to be more involved, or whatever it may be, I get it, and my job is to be faithful. And if God is calling you to be faithful elsewhere, well, then Godspeed, and we'll miss you.
I think, like, Delmar, what you said in the beginning really challenged me. You said, if we as pastors are trying to create a better product, if we're treating church like a product, then we refuse the right to be upset when people treat our church like a product.
Yeah.
And I think what I am challenged by that is asking the question, how do we, because you said in turn, we turn this into a family, right? And family makes, when you're in a family, the idea of leaving this family is out the window. It's we got to figure out a way to make this work. And I don't want, obviously, there are some people who should leave the church because their pastor's manipulative, it's toxic, it's abusive, spiritual abuse, all that stuff is real. And so I'm not going to discredit those experiences whatsoever. But we also know that a lot of people are leaving the church for very petty or small reasons that are actually not biblical or not accurate. And I guess my question is what have you done in your churches to make sure your church is not a product but a family? Or you know what I'm saying? I love our church is the same thing. We call it a covenant partnership, because one, that's super cool. It sounds like a membership. But two, I think it's that's probably a better picture of what you're agreeing to. This isn't Sam's Club where you can just kind of get out in a year. Right. This is we're agreeing to this, and there are some implications that you're agreeing to. You're agreeing to accountability. You're agreeing to tithe faithfully. You're agreeing to these things, and we are agreeing to you that we will faithfully guide you in God's word and shepherd you. So there's this covenant that's being made. But how have you kind of painted that picture in your church that this is not a gym that you join and you pay your monthly dues, but this is a relationship, a covenant family that you've entered into. So therefore, when you are leaving, there's as much implications in that as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's some really good clarity, Frank, the covenant part, because you're right. All of us have seen churches that are too much like a family and no one's welcome. You know what I'm saying? You can swing too hard to where you can't break into that community no matter what. But one of the things that I try to do in our congregation to foster this idea of you're in a covenant relationship is it really comes through the branch of pastoral care. I'm making sure that in some way our church is in your face. Just today, all of my deacons are dropping by the offices, and every one of them is picking up the book, Stop Asking Jesus Into Your Heart. And inside of every book, I've tucked one entire page of congregants' names and phone numbers. And every deacon is going to be calling through that page over the next 3 weeks.
Elmar, you're the man.
We're going to, yeah. Well, I have good teachers here. So and their whole thing is hey man, you have to create that environment. It doesn't create itself,
Wow.
So and I told him, I was if you guys are going to be on the front lines having these conversations, well, number one, you got to be able to articulate the gospel, so here's your primer and then here's your paper. So, but I think for me, it is a lot to do with that pastoral care, because that's what reminds me that I'm in a family. Family are people that we share our struggles with, that we share our victories with, but also to your point with it being seasons. Hey, there's a time in a lot of families when the children do move away and start their own families and join. So I think it's holding that fluidity. But for us, the biggest stab we take at that is through pastoral care.
I think for me, one area that I think of, and I agree with you with pastoral care, right? I'm really influenced by Jeff Vanderstelt's writing. I don't know if you know that name, but Saturate and Gospel Fluency are two of his books. But he talks in some of his, he has these whiteboard training sessions that he'll do. And what he talks about is that too many times churches are like spiritual orphanages where there's only like one adult and everybody else is children,
Mm.
and they just perpetually stay that way.
Wow.
And I think when it comes to this stuff, one of the ways that I think you can work against, and it's hard and it takes a long time and it's really can be frustrating. But when it comes to conflict between people, is you not solving those problems for them, and forcing them to actually go to that person. There's somebody in my church who somebody posted something pretty insensitive in terms of the Black Lives Matter stuff. And we have a person in our church who is African American, and they came to me and were like, I'm so frustrated at so-and-so that they posted that. It's super insensitive. And I agreed with them. I even had actually gone to the person who posted it in messages and said like, hey, this might not be the best thing to post. Have you thought about this? And I had a great conversation with him. And then, that was like on a Thursday or Friday. And on Sunday, my African-American church member said like, I'm so mad at so-and-so for posting that. And instead of trying to like fix that, I just said, well, I mean, he's right over there. Why don't you go have a conversation? And that's probably been 5 or 6 weeks. And I've been asking every week, like, hey, have you had the chance to talk to so-and-so yet? Have you had the chance to talk to so-and-so yet? And, I think at this point, I'm not sure that the conversation is going to happen. But I think if you constantly are the one that's like, oh, well, this is why, and I'm going to help you, then you are making it kind of all about you as the leader. And you're you're displaying that I'm the only one that's mature here.
Wow. That's going to run some people off, man.
It might, but
no, I lost some congregants over doing what you just said. You say, hey, Matthew 18 says you go to that person, not me.
But they want you to handle it because you're basically, to use that orphanage metaphor, you're the only adult in the room, and you're the one that's we hired you to handle this stuff, so I don't have to do this. It sometimes can be the attitude.
If you're on a church that has multiple staff members and like this is, I know a lot of youth pastors and associate pastors listen to this, and I feel like sometimes you find yourself when you're not the main person and you're like over a youth ministry or small groups that you become the safe staff member where like people can vent to. And I think like the thing that often happens in situations, it's like it makes yourself feel really good because no one has beef with you because they're all gossiping about the senior pastor to you, right? And so it feels really good. But the one thing that you have to wrestle with is doing kind of what Jeff just said, like, because that like constant like pessimism or bitterness that they're feeling about the senior pastor or some other pastor, they're good with you, but you're not going to be the one that's going to be the reason why they stay there. They're going to leave because of the senior pastor. And so like one thing that we have to do when you're that like go-to staff member, even within like church staff dynamics, right? Like other staff members could be like, oh, I don't like the decision you made. Well, like, don't talk to me about, I mean, you can talk to me about it, but maybe you should talk to the senior pastor. Like his job or her job is always open for you to go talk to that person, right? And I think like one thing over the years that I've really wrestled with is whenever there was a decision really, really high up top, whether it was an elder or a senior pastor move, and I was a youth pastor, and now as a campus pastor, my thing is like, hey, I hear you. Let me kind of maybe help answer some of the misconceptions that may be happening because you're not seeing the whole picture or something. But I would encourage you to not let these feelings of bitterness stay within you and just kind of expel them on me, but actually send that email, get the coffee with the senior pastor, because it's hard to harbor bitterness when you actually have a relationship with someone. It's hard to harbor bitterness when you actually have the conversation face to face, because it's so easy to look at the senior pastor, the elders, and say us versus them. But when you actually encourage them to have that conversation, now what you said, Delmar, is true. Encouraging them to have those conversations may be the callous to say, this is too difficult, I'm just going to leave. But that's probably the better response as a staff member than to say, yeah, tell me more, and let me even tell you why I probably agree with you, but I can't say anything because I'm on staff. Like,
well, since gossip is
helpful.
A sin,
I agree.
That's definitely better to do.
I mean, exactly. God, and like, and I would even tell that person like I would be gentle with that person and say, hey, we need to be careful with this discussion because this discussion can easily turn into gossip and slander.
Absolutely.
And the conversation that you can have with that person can always be had. you know.
Well,
Going
and
back-
in my example, like I have to be willing to discipline both the offender and the offended party, because if the offended party is refusing to talk to their brother,
They're in sin.
then they're also in sin. Yeah. So they like you can't self-righteousness when you're the one that was offended is still self-righteousness. And it's still wrong for you to refuse to go and reconcile with your brother. That's why if any one of you is caught in sin, let those of you who are spiritual restore that brother. You know, so it takes maturity to help two people who are in conflict. And I think what that does is it takes the limelight off of you as the problem solver hero. And you're hopefully getting people mature enough to the point where they can handle their own. You know, I would love to get to the point where I don't even hear about church conflicts until 2 years later when they were reconciled for 2 years, because the maturity level is there, you know?